In the immediate, dust-choked aftermath of September 11, 2001, a stunned world grappled with the sheer scale of the attacks that had scarred the American consciousness. The images of collapsing towers and a smoldering Pentagon were seared into the global memory. And with the grief came a steely resolve. The United States and its allies quickly identified the mastermind behind the coordinated horror, Osama bin Laden, the enigmatic leader of the al-Qaeda terrorist network. A swift and unwavering decision was made at the highest levels of government. He would be hunted down, and his organization would be dismantled. The hunt for public enemy number one had officially begun, marking the start of a new, uncertain chapter in global security and warfare. The focus of this unprecedented manhunt immediately turned to the rugged, unforgiving landscape of Afghanistan. For years, the country had served as a sanctuary for bin Laden and his followers, a place where they could operate with relative impunity under the protection of the ruling Taliban regime. A month after the devastating attacks, as the world watched and waited, bin Laden made a final public appearance. He was last seen in the eastern Afghan city of Jalalabad, where he gathered local tribal chiefs and influential leaders. His message was one of defiance, a call to arms urging them to resist the inevitable American military response that was already looming on the horizon like a gathering storm. This public display of confidence was a calculated move, designed to project strength and rally support among his allies in the region. He understood that the mountains and valleys of Afghanistan could become a formidable fortress, but only with the cooperation and loyalty of the local populace who knew the terrain intimately. As American B-52s began to streak across the Afghan skies, dropping the first wave of bombs on Taliban and al-Qaeda positions, bin Laden was no longer a shadowy figure in propaganda videos. He was a man on the run, the most wanted individual on the planet, with the full military and intelligence might of the United States dedicated to his capture or death. The manhunt was on. The price on his head, a staggering figure announced to the world, underscored the gravity of the mission. Every intelligence agency, every covert operative, and every military unit in the region was mobilized with a singular objective. The initial intelligence pointed squarely toward his last known location, making the city of Jalalabad and its surrounding areas the first major focal point in a pursuit that would span nearly a decade. The world was on high alert, and the opening moves were being made in a deadly game of cat and mouse that would play out across some of the most remote and hostile territory on Earth. Starting in the heart of bin Laden's Afghan stronghold. Jalalabad was not just another city on the map of Afghanistan. For al-Qaeda, it was the nerve center of its global operations. Nestled in a strategic valley in the country's east, its proximity to the Pakistani border made it an ideal hub for moving fighters, weapons, and funds. For Osama bin Laden, the city represented a significant power base, a place where he had cultivated deep ties with local sympathizers and established a formidable presence. He had transformed the area into a major stronghold, a sanctuary where his vision of global jihad could be nurtured and exported. The city, with its bustling markets and surrounding farmlands, provided a perfect cover for the clandestine activities that were being planned and executed from within its limits. The significance of Jalalabad was most starkly represented by the sprawling training camp that bin Laden had established there. This was not a makeshift operation. It was one of al-Qaeda's most important and sophisticated facilities. Known by various names, the camp was a production line for militants, drawing recruits from across the Muslim world and beyond. Young men arrived from Europe, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, eager to be indoctrinated into bin Laden's violent ideology. Here, they were taught the fundamentals of guerrilla warfare, the fine art of bomb-making, and the brutal tactics of asymmetrical conflict. The curriculum was designed to create a generation of dedicated fighters loyal to bin Laden's cause. The camp was more than just a military academy, it was a center for ideological conditioning. Recruits spent their days in rigorous physical training, and their evenings absorbing radical sermons and studying extremist literature. The goal was to strip them of their former identities and remold them into soldiers of al-Qaeda. The effectiveness of this system was terrifyingly clear. Jalalabad had become the heart from which the poison of extremism was pumped throughout the world, turning disaffected young men into hardened terrorists, capable of carrying out complex and devastating attacks against civilian targets. The city was, in essence, the capital of bin Laden's self-proclaimed caliphate of terror. When the American-led coalition began its military campaign in Afghanistan in October 2001, Jalalabad and its associated training camps were among the very first targets. The United States understood that to cripple al-Qaeda, it had to strike at its core infrastructure. The subsequent bombing raids were intense and relentless, aimed at obliterating the facilities and scattering the fighters who called the area home. The fall of Jalalabad was a critical early victory for the coalition forces, but it also marked the moment Osama bin Laden slipped from a position of command and became a hunted fugitive, forced to flee the city that had once been the very symbol of his power. The training camp near Jalalabad was not just for ordinary foot soldiers. It was the very crucible where the weapon of September 11th was forged. Among the hundreds of recruits who passed through its gates were the key operatives who would later carry out the deadliest terrorist attack in history. Recovered propaganda footage and intelligence reports have since provided a chilling glimpse into their time in Afghanistan. Several of the 9/11 hijackers, including notable figures like Saeed al-Ghamdi, Hamza al-Ghamdi, Walid al-Sheri, and Ahmed al-Nami, are clearly visible in videos recorded at the camp. These tapes show them engaging in weapons training, studying maps, and calmly discussing their impending mission of mass destruction. This footage serves as undeniable proof of Jalalabad's central role in the 9/11 plot. The men are seen not as crazed fanatics, but as disciplined and dedicated operatives, meticulously preparing for their task. They are shown handling automatic weapons, practicing hand-to-hand combat, and participating in simulated attacks. These training sessions were designed to prepare them for every eventuality of their mission, from subduing the flight crew and passengers to navigating the aircraft toward their targets. The camp provided them with both the practical skills and the psychological reinforcement needed to transform them from ordinary men into instruments of terror, willing to sacrifice their own lives to kill thousands of civilians. When the US-led bombing campaign began in earnest, in November 2001, the Jalalabad camp was hit hard. The relentless aerial bombardment turned the once bustling facility into a landscape of rubble and twisted metal. The barracks, training obstacles, and ammunition depots were systematically destroyed, leaving behind a ghost town of craters and debris. When Afghan Northern Alliance forces, supported by American special operators, finally entered the area, they found it deserted. The remnants they discovered, however, told a powerful story. Scattered among the ruins were training manuals, discarded equipment, and the crucial propaganda tapes that would later help intelligence agencies piece together the puzzle of the 9/11 conspiracy. The capture of the camp was a symbolic victory, but the primary targets had already vanished. The destruction of the facility was a major blow to al-Qaeda's operational capacity, but it could not undo the damage that had already been done. The men who trained there had already been dispatched to the West, embedding themselves in American society as they awaited their final orders. The bombed-out shell of the Jalalabad camp stood as a testament to the evil that had been planned within its walls. But it also served as a stark reminder that the perpetrators and their leader were still at large, having already moved on to their next hiding place. With Jalalabad no longer a safe haven and American bombs raining down on his positions, Osama bin Laden was forced to make a critical decision. Staying in the city was not an option. His presence made it a magnet for coalition airstrikes, endangering himself and what remained of his command structure. His only viable path to survival was to retreat into the vast, inhospitable terrain that had protected Afghan fighters from foreign invaders for centuries. Accompanied by a loyal contingent of his most trusted bodyguards, senior lieutenants, and a core group of Arab fighters, bin Laden began his exodus from Jalalabad. Their destination was a remote and formidable mountain range known as Tora Bora. The journey was fraught with peril. The group had to move cautiously, primarily at night, to avoid detection by American surveillance drones and reconnaissance aircraft that constantly patrolled the skies. They abandoned modern vehicles, which were too conspicuous and vulnerable to attack, in favor of more traditional and discreet methods of travel. They relied on rugged pack animals and their own 2 feet, traversing a network of ancient smugglers' trails and goat paths that snaked through the steep foothills. This was familiar territory for many of the Afghan guides who assisted them, but for bin Laden and his predominantly Arab followers, it was a physically grueling and mentally taxing ordeal that tested their endurance to its limits. The choice of Tora Bora was highly strategic. Located in the Spingar, or White Mountains, the area was a natural fortress of soaring peaks, deep ravines, and a complex network of caves. It was incredibly difficult to access, with few roads leading into its interior, making it a nightmare for a conventional military force to assault. More importantly, Tora Bora sat perilously close to the porous and largely unpatrolled border with Pakistan's tribal areas. This proximity offered bin Laden a crucial escape route, a backdoor he could use if the American pressure became too intense. He was not merely seeking a hiding place, he was positioning himself for a potential final stand or a swift getaway. As bin Laden and his entourage made their way deeper into the mountains, they were effectively leaving the conventional world behind. They were moving from a structured urban stronghold to a primitive and lawless wilderness where the only authority was the gun and the only law was survival. This retreat marked a significant shift in the hunt. The conflict was no longer about taking cities or destroying training camps. It had become a personal pursuit of one man and his inner circle through some of the most challenging and dangerous geography on the planet. The chase had moved from the city streets of Jalalabad to the snowy peaks of Tora Bora. As Osama bin Laden and his followers closed in on the Tora Bora region, he executed a shrewd and ruthless tactical maneuver designed to confuse his pursuers and increase his own chances of survival. He knew that a single large group of fighters would be a much easier target for American air power. A large convoy, even one moving on foot, would leave a significant trail and present a concentrated target for the powerful bombs being dropped by B-52s. To mitigate this risk, he made the cold and calculated decision to divide his forces. He ordered the bulk of his fighters, a group numbering in the hundreds, to take a more direct and obvious route toward the mountains. This main group was, in effect, a sacrificial lamb. By sending them along a more predictable path, bin Laden created a diversion. This larger force would inevitably attract the attention of American reconnaissance assets and become the primary focus of the ensuing bombing raids. While the US military concentrated its firepower on this decoy group, bin Laden, along with his most essential personnel, his senior command staff, his personal bodyguards, and a small number of elite fighters, would take a separate, much more difficult and discreet path. This smaller, more agile unit could move with greater stealth, leaving behind a minimal signature for American surveillance to detect. The strategy worked exactly as he had planned. US intelligence and military planners, seeing a large contingent of al-Qaeda fighters moving toward Tora Bora, directed the full force of their air campaign against them. The results were devastating. The main group was relentlessly pounded from the air in a series of massive bombing raids. Trapped in the narrow valleys and exposed mountain passes, they were, as one account later described, largely exterminated. They had served their purpose, buying their leader precious time and drawing the enemy's fire away from his true location, a testament to their fanatical loyalty and his cold-hearted pragmatism. Meanwhile, bin Laden's smaller group navigated the treacherous, lesser-known trails, moving through the mountains like ghosts. They traveled in near silence, taking advantage of the harsh terrain to mask their movement. This tactic of sacrificing the many to save the few was a classic guerrilla strategy, and it proved to be incredibly effective. By the time the Americans realized they had been duped, and that the man they were truly after was not among the dead in the bombed-out valleys, bin Laden and his inner circle had already reached the relative safety of the Tora Bora cave complex, ready to prepare for the next phase of their desperate fight for survival. In the heat of the chase, American military officials and the global media began to paint a dramatic picture of Osama bin Laden's mountain hideout. Tora Bora was portrayed as a high-tech, multi-story underground fortress, a villain's lair worthy of a Hollywood blockbuster. The description spoke of a sophisticated complex complete with its own ventilation systems, hydroelectric power, and vast chambers capable of housing thousands of fighters. It was imagined as an impenetrable bunker, burrowed deep into the heart of the mountains, from which bin Laden could command his forces and withstand a prolonged siege. This narrative helped justify the massive bombing campaign and built public expectations of a climactic battle. The reality on the ground, however, was far more primitive and mundane. The Tora Bora that bin Laden and his men inhabited was not a man-made superbunker. Instead, it was a sprawling network of natural caves, small crevices, and simple man-made shelters that had been used for centuries by smugglers, local tribesmen, and mujahideen fighters during the Soviet-Afghan War. These were not vast, interconnected caverns, but rather small, damp, and cold hollows carved into the rock face. Most of these caves were only large enough to shelter a dozen men at most, or to serve as small storage depots for ammunition, food, and other basic supplies. Life inside these caves was incredibly harsh. The fighters endured freezing temperatures, constant dampness, and a lack of basic sanitation. They were exposed to the elements and the ever-present threat of rockfalls or discovery. Far from being a comfortable headquarters, it was a miserable and precarious existence. The fortress of Tora Bora was not made of reinforced concrete and steel doors, but of natural rock and the sheer resilience of the men hiding within it. Its true defensive strength came not from technology, but from the brutal and confusing nature of the mountain landscape itself, which made it incredibly difficult for outsiders to navigate and assault. This stark contrast between the myth and the reality of Tora Bora is crucial to understanding how bin Laden ultimately slipped away. The focus on finding and destroying a mythical, centralized fortress may have diverted attention and resources from the more practical task of sealing the perimeter and cutting off all possible escape routes. While the American military was busy dropping bunker-busting bombs on solid rock, imagining they were collapsing a sophisticated underground city, bin Laden and his men were hunkered down in simple caves, planning their next move and watching for their chance to escape through the very terrain that was their greatest protection. In December 2001, the United States and its Afghan allies decided the time had come to launch a decisive ground assault on Tora Bora. The plan was to encircle the mountain range and squeeze bin Laden and his remaining fighters until they had nowhere left to run. The offensive was a two-pronged effort. On one side, American Special Forces operators worked alongside their Afghan counterparts, primarily militia forces loyal to local warlords who had turned against the Taliban. On the other side was the overwhelming power of the United States Air Force, which unleashed a relentless bombing campaign, dropping thousands of tons of explosives on suspected cave locations. The mountains shook with the force of the constant detonations. The ground assault was brutal and slow-moving. The Afghan militias, though familiar with the terrain, were often poorly coordinated and sometimes more interested in securing territory for themselves than in capturing high-value al-Qaeda targets. They advanced cautiously up the treacherous slopes, engaging in fierce firefights with the cornered but determined al-Qaeda defenders. The Arab fighters, knowing they faced certain death or capture, fought with fanaticism, using the natural cover of the rocks and caves to mount a stubborn resistance. For days the battle raged across the frozen peaks, a desperate struggle waged in thin air and freezing temperatures. Despite the immense firepower being brought to bear, a critical flaw existed in the strategy. The American military command, perhaps over-reliant on its Afghan partners and hesitant to commit a large number of its own ground troops to such a perilous operation, failed to completely seal the southern and eastern escape routes. These paths led over the highest passes of the Spingar Mountains and directly into the semi-autonomous tribal areas of Pakistan. While American and Afghan forces were pushing hard from the north and west, the back door was effectively left ajar, guarded only by the harsh winter weather and the extreme altitude. This tactical oversight proved to be fatal to the mission. As the siege tightened and the bombing intensified, bin Laden recognized that his position was untenable. Staying in Tora Bora meant certain death. Under the cover of darkness and aided by local guides who knew the secret paths, he and a small group of his most loyal followers made their final move. They did not fight to the last man as some had expected. Instead, they quietly slipped through the gaps in the cordon, beginning a grueling high-altitude trek through the snow-covered mountains, leaving the Battle of Tora Bora behind them as they headed for the relative safety of a new country. The escape from Tora Bora was an arduous and desperate journey. Osama bin Laden, accompanied by a small remnant of his followers, embarked on a grueling 12-hour trek on foot through the highest, most unforgiving passes of the White Mountains. They moved in small, scattered groups to avoid detection, battling extreme cold, deep snow, and the constant threat of being spotted by American surveillance. The journey pushed them to the limits of human endurance, a testament to their desperation and resolve. They were guided by local smugglers who knew the secret ways across the frontier, paths that did not appear on any official military maps and were invisible from the sky. Their destination was Pakistan. After crossing the border under the cover of a harsh winter night, They descended from the mountains and arrived at the small, remote Pakistani village of Parachinar. This village, located in the Kuram tribal agency, was the first stop on their journey to safety. It was here that bin Laden and his men could finally rest, regroup, and begin to blend into a new environment. Once in Parachinar, the group quickly dispersed. They shed their distinct Afghan clothing, adopted local attire, and melted away into the surrounding population, making it nearly impossible to track their subsequent movements. They had successfully escaped the largest manhunt in history. For the United States military and intelligence community, this was a moment of profound failure and frustration. At this point, in January 2002, they officially lost the trail. The man who had been firmly in their sights, cornered in a specific mountain range, had vanished into thin air. The hunt had been reset to zero. Bin Laden was no longer confined to a single battlefield in Afghanistan. He was now potentially anywhere within the vast and complex landscape of Pakistan, a country with deep pockets of sympathy for his cause and regions where the central government's authority was virtually non-existent. The escape into Pakistan marked the beginning of a new, much more challenging phase of the manhunt. The search was no longer a military operation focused on a geographical location, but an intelligence-driven quest that relied on chasing down faint rumors, electronic whispers, and human sources. Bin Laden had gone to ground, disappearing from public view and severing almost all direct communication with the outside world. He had become a ghost, a phantom who had slipped through the fingers of the world's most powerful military at the very moment they believed they had him trapped. The long, frustrating years of searching had just begun. After his escape from Tora Bora, Osama bin Laden became the world's most elusive fugitive. The trail went cold for years, punctuated only by periodic, unconfirmed intelligence reports and the occasional release of a pre-recorded audio or video message. These messages, delivered to television networks through clandestine channels, proved that he was still alive and served as a constant, taunting reminder of the failure to capture him. Sightings were reported from various locations across Pakistan. At one point in early 2003, US intelligence suggested he might be hiding in plain sight in Karachi, a sprawling and chaotic megacity of over 12 million people, its dense urban jungle providing the perfect anonymity for a man on the run. The years dragged on, and the search for bin Laden became a frustrating and often fruitless endeavor. He moved between a series of safe houses in Pakistan, protected by a small, tight-knit circle of loyalists, and a network of sympathizers who helped ensure his survival. He lived a life of extreme caution and secrecy, cut off from the operational command of the organization he had founded, while he remained a powerful symbolic and inspirational figure for extremists worldwide. His direct role in planning attacks diminished significantly. He had become a ghost in the machine, a leader in exile whose primary function was to simply stay alive and evade capture. The long hunt finally came to a dramatic and violent end, nearly a decade after it began. On May 2, 2011, acting on a hard-won intelligence breakthrough, a team of elite US Navy SEALs conducted a daring nighttime raid on a private residential compound in the city of Abbottabad, Pakistan. The city, ironically, was home to a major Pakistani military academy. It was here, not in a remote cave, but in a comfortable, high-walled compound that the world's most wanted man had been hiding. In a brief and intense firefight, Osama bin Laden was killed by the American Special Forces. His death marked the conclusion of an epic 10-year manhunt. The legacy of Osama bin Laden is complex and deeply divisive. To the vast majority of the world, he remains the personification of evil, the architect of a hateful ideology that brought immense suffering and death. His actions triggered wars, reshaped global politics, and ushered in an era of heightened security and suspicion. For a small but dangerous minority, however, he remains a martyr and a hero who stood up to the West. Though his physical presence is gone, the shadow he cast over the early 21st century is long, and the extremist movements he inspired continue to pose a threat, ensuring that his untold journey from the mountains of Afghanistan to a compound in Pakistan will not soon be forgotten.